July 1945, the Labour government inherited the world's largest empire with a degree of discomfort. After more than a decade in opposition, they returned to power only weeks before the end of World War II. Tasked with reconstruction, post-war Britain faced a litany of problems. Heavy wartime borrowing left it the world's largest debtor, while a shortage of dollars and a worsening balance of payments deepened its dependence on US imports. Britain looked to the vast resources of its African colonies to support its broader reconstruction efforts, and most importantly for this story, to relieve acute shortages of edible fats. Out of this crisis came the ill-fated Groundnut Scheme, which ran from 1947 to 1951 in Tanganyika, now modern-day Tanzania, with the goal of mass-producing peanuts on an industrial scale. Aware of their anti-imperial credentials, Labour's dilemma was how to use the empire without abusing the empire. Against this backdrop, this video explores changing perceptions of the empire in post-war Britain, or rather its shift towards a self-fashioned, benevolent imperialism, through the lens of the Groundnut Scheme. I hope this video is of interest to international development practitioners grappling with what makes big projects succeed or fail miserably, as well as anyone curious about the British Empire's most infamous flop. When the war ended, Britain confronted a host of pressing new problems, including a critical shortage of edible fats such as butter, lard, and vegetable oils. An October 1945 cartoon captures the nation on the brink of a new storm, harassed by issues such as the end of the Lend-Lease, geopolitical concerns over Russia, the Balkans, and the US, as well as fuel and food shortages. Surprisingly, food rationing not only continued but intensified after the war. Rations for butter, margarine, and cooking fats were first introduced in 1940 and with some fluctuations remained in place until the mid-1950s. By August 1947, a writer for the Hull Daily Mail warned that the main cause of anxiety in the future is the diminishing quantity of oilseeds. Food shortages in general and fats in particular persisted for at least 3 reasons. First, food production had been severely disrupted by the war. Economies were redirected towards armament, transport routes were blocked, crops were destroyed, and the whaling industry had virtually collapsed. By early 1946, European production was below 25% pre-war levels, and world production below 12%. Second, despite major wartime casualties, the global population grew by an estimated 125 million between 1938 and 1945. Finally, as economies began to recover, major producers of edible oils such as India, China, and the Dutch East Indies reduced exports to meet their own rising demand. This hit Britain hard as it relied on imports for over 90% of its fat supply. The combined effect was a stark global imbalance between supply and demand. Even without factoring in population growth, the world shortage in 1948 was estimated at around 2 million tons of fat, or the equivalent of 5 million tons of groundnuts. To the frustration of many, rationing continued. Housewives, the demographic responsible for implementing the ration policy on a daily basis through meal planning, shopping, and cooking, were particularly aggrieved with the prolongation of rationing. During the war, women's magazines offered inventive recipes to help housewives stretch limited supplies and even advise readers to strain and reuse cooking fats. Patriotic acceptance during the war was giving way to disillusionment, evidenced by the creation of the British Housewives' League in June 1945. The League emerged after Ben Smith, the Minister of Food, announced that rationing would not be eased following the war, and in fact, that allocations of bacon, poultry, and eggs would be further reduced. A speech by protester Constance Hill at a 700-strong rally in Chilwell, Liverpool, on 8 February 1946, illustrates this growing dissatisfaction. We are suffering from mental exhaustion, irritation, and frustration. The smiling mother of yesterday is the bad-tempered mother of today. In all, political pressure was mounting and something needed to be done before the next election. Many officials believed that a grand solution was necessary to solve the fats crisis. Frank Samuel, managing director of the United African Company, predicted that the shortage would last well into the 1960s without a large-scale operation to enhance production. John Wakefield, former director of agriculture in Tanganyika and steadfast backer of the scheme, argued that Britain had no longer sufficient manpower or land to feed itself. There was, quote, no solution to it in this generation at least, unless some great new source of production is developed. Minister of Food John Strachey likewise argued to Cabinet on 4th January 1948 that a large scheme, quote, is the only way in which our Central African possessions can be rapidly developed, so they can become economic and strategic assets instead of liabilities. Together, these 3 individuals, more than anyone, promoted the idea that a large-scale mechanized production of groundnuts in Africa was the solution to the fats dilemma. The genesis of the groundnut scheme originally lay in corporate interests. Working for the UAC, a subsidiary of Unilever, Samuel was sent to Africa to identify suitable land for cultivating oil-bearing crops. At the time, Unilever monopolized the margarine market of Western Europe and provided the British Empire with two-thirds of its soap. According to Alan Wood's memoir, The Groundnut Affair, Samuel, whilst flying over Tanganyika, wondered, quote, whether this wasteland could not grow oil crops to the benefit of the margarine ration of the British housewife and the legitimate profits of the United African Company. After seeking approval from the current Director of Agriculture in Tanganyika, Ralph Miller, Samuel proposed the idea to the Minister of Food, Ben Smith, who, desperate to be seen doing something about the fat shortage, was, quote, immediately interested in the possibilities. Smith in turn spread the word to Cabinet, who immediately granted the dispatch of an envoy of experts to survey land in Tanganyika in June 1946. Once revealed to the public, it was met with a mix of curiosity, skepticism, mockery, and even anger. Joseph Lee's 1946 cartoon, by depicting monkeys frantically collecting nuts for Britain's Great Nut Collection, ridicules the African solution as a silly and unrealistic quick fix. Whereas historian Charlotte Riley argues the choice of monkeys undoubtedly serves to racialize the African workforce, it is interesting to note that the worker monkeys wear British clothes such as caps, trousers, and dungarees, while the foreman dons a bowler hat and spectacles. So yes, although drawing on racist stereotypes to elicit laughs, the clothing subtly suggests that the butt of the joke is on the British rather than the African. This is consistent with Lee's reputation, not as a racial polemicist, but as a humorist of British life. Meanwhile, some viewed the scheme with indignation. Newspapers from the time are filled with invectives over lavish public spending on the colonies, with urges to focus instead on the development of the highlands, North Sea fishing, and their domestic beef industry. By 1949, one writer even complained that Africans on the scheme were being fed 510 more calories than the average Brit. Of all the British colonies, Tanganyika suffered the most from chronic underinvestment. From 1884 to 1918, the modern territory of Tanzania was administered as a German imperial protectorate named German East Africa. After World War I, when Germany lost all of its overseas territory, it became a League of Nations mandate territory in 1922, controlled but not owned outright by Britain. Renamed Tanganyika, by 1920s it contained only 3 million inhabitants belonging to over 100 tribes. Languages were diverse. Centralized political organization was non-existent. There were few towns or cities, and whole regions were only accessible by foot due to poor transportation and communication networks. Sleeping sickness from the tsetse fly was a common affliction. Having only recently been introduced to a monetary economy, most inhabitants still depended on subsistence farming. Relying on indirect rule, whereby local chiefs collected taxes, by 1947 there were still fewer than 200 British civil servants in the territory. However, cash cropping was beginning to burgeon. Thistle, coffee, cotton, and rubber were grown on European estates near the Kilimanjaro highlands, and increasingly during British rule, by smallholder farmers for export. The war further turned a neglected outpost into a valued asset. Thistle, a large, spiky, fibrous plant used for rope, was grown on large estates by migrant workers and exported for the war effort. When Asian supplies were cut off, Tanganyika became the world's largest exporter of hard fibers. With this potential in mind, there was an increasing sense after World War II that this vast territory, nearly 1 million square kilometers or twice the size of California, was full of untapped resources, though remained unexploited. Speaking of Africa more generally, the point had first been made by Frederick Lugard in 1922, who argued that, quote, vast areas of exceptionally fertile land is sitting idle as unreclaimed jungle, and that it is the duty of colonial powers to bring these lands into productive use through science, capital, and European enterprise. In 1946, Governor of Kenya, Philip Mitchell, pressed the British government to bring Tanganyika's less readily cultivatable land into production, areas long uninhabited due to tsetse fly, water scarcity, and remoteness. Later that year, Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin acknowledged that primary products and resources within the Commonwealth had been badly neglected. Even on the other side of the world, in Hobart, Australia, a writer from the Mercury declared that it is essential that someone should produce extra food for the world, before mentioning Tanganyika as one of the half-empty places of the world that could produce more food. Being land-rich and relatively population-poor, Tanganyika seemed like an ideal location. The 9-week feasibility mission began on the 20th of June 1948 and involved John Wakefield, John Rosa of the Colonial Office, and David Martin, head of the Plantation Department of the UAC. Employing the Royal Air Force, around 30,000 miles were surveyed from the sky. Since land alienation was a sensitive issue in British African colonies, the selected sites had to appear largely unoccupied by native inhabitants. Remote, covered in coarse tsetse fly-infested thorny bush, and lacking adequate groundwater, the areas of Kongwa in the centre, Nanchingwea in the south, and Yirambo in the west were chosen. Nonetheless, land is rarely truly unoccupied. Nearly 300 families were eventually displaced in Kongwa and at least 300 around Nanchingwea, the latter involving considerable passive resistance. Groundnuts were chosen not only for their high oil, calorie, and protein content, but also for their suitability to Tanganyika's poor sandy soils, nitrogen-fixing qualities, and their relatively low rainfall requirements. At the end of the survey, a highly optimistic paper, the Wakefield Report, was submitted to Cabinet on 30th October 1946. In its scale, the Groundnut Scheme was a first in colonial agricultural planning, representing the largest single attempt at state-directed mechanized farming ever undertaken by Britain in any of its colonies. The Wakefield Report envisioned some 3.5 million acres of land, or the equivalent of Yorkshire, to be put under cultivation. Upon announcement, a Times article called it the boldest and most comprehensive scheme ever launched for the development of backward territories. While the majority of operations were to be carried out in Tanganyika's Southern Province, Central Province, and Western Province, smaller units were also earmarked for Kenya and Rhodesia. In the wake of World War II, the perceived success of centralized planning and the power of collected will inspired a major shift in colonial development policy towards projects of unprecedented scale. Indeed, the whole scheme was approached in a quasi-military manner. The Wakefield Report promised that the scheme's chances of failure are remote if pursued with the determination and urgency characteristic of a major wartime operation. Its director, Major General Desmond Harrison, was a former Royal Engineers officer, and many of its personnel had only recently left the battlefield. Even tractors, dubbed Shervicks, were fashioned from old tanks. Military language pervaded discussions of the project. Scratchy called it Operation Groundnuts, whereas Wood referred to its labourers as the Groundnut Army. Replacing the laissez-faire attitude of previous decades, Britain now applied the capital-driven logic of wartime mobilization to development. Based on largely speculative figures, the scheme was justified in cost-effective language. According to Samuel, the whole basis of the scheme lies in its economic soundness. Production was expected to reach 600,000 tonnes by the fifth year and 800,000 tonnes at full capacity. Although it was projected to cost around £26 million, it was supposed to generate £10 million in profit every year, making a 40% return on investment. Financial advisor at the Colonial Office, John Rosa, later admitted that no one knew any better and it was all guesswork. The Treasury was initially skeptical, given that the entire scheme would be financed with taxpayers' money, but it was persuaded by the argument that groundnuts produced in East Africa would cost only £10 per tonne compared with the £25 per tonne then being paid for on the world market in scarce US dollars. By preserving dollars, the project was also seen as a means to help repay the $3.5 billion debt that Britain owed the United States. Thus, it was a colossal venture whose promise of immense rewards inevitably carried the risk of equally immense failure. In fear of appearing imperialistic, the Labour government had to stress the scheme's benefits to not just Britons or the world, but to Tanganyikans directly and indirectly involved. In October 1947, Bevan cautioned the Cabinet that Britain's post-war development policy must appear to be motivated by mutual benefit rather than exploitation, remarking that our plans for the development of our colonial dependencies cannot in any way be represented as springing solely from our own selfish interests. Later in January 1948, Cabinet Secretary Norman Brooke warned Prime Minister Clement Attlee that the rapid development of African resources for Britain's benefit could, I suppose, be said to fall within the ordinary definition of imperialism. He cautioned that the government risked damaging misrepresentation, namely being portrayed as exploiting native peoples for domestic gain. Brooke advised that with the utmost care and preparation, it was essential to present the program in a way that emphasizes mutual development rather than imperial extraction. Paradoxically, it was the Conservatives who led early parliamentary objections to the scheme's imperialist character. In November 1947, Conservative MP Walter Fletcher asked in Parliament whether any profits from the scheme would remain in Tanganyika, be taken by Britain, or be shared between them. Minister of Food John Scratchy replied only that the matter would be determined through later negotiations. In the end, the question proved moot as the scheme never achieved profitability. Another Conservative MP, Arthur Dodds Parker, argued in January 1948 that the public corporation responsible for the scheme after taking it over from the UAC, the Overseas Food Corporation, would become a monopolistic body, and since it was answerable to the Minister of Food, would place priority on increasing the fat ration of the British voter over the well-being of the people in these colonial territories. In March 1948, Alan Lennox Boyd argued that the scheme effectively made Tanganyika a state-run estate. By substituting peasant ownership for a vulnerable wage proletariat, it entrenched rather than loosened colonial control. Other conservatives, however, defended the scheme, arguing that development would head off communist sympathies in the colonies. Meanwhile, industrial economist Edith Penrose rejected the view that all colonial policy was inherently imperialistic and therefore sinister. She argued that Britain's work in Tanganyika represented a new humanitarian phase of empire, one emphasizing the social, economic, and political development of the native peoples, rather than the abuse-ridden economic exploitation typical of earlier imperialism. Penrose portrayed the scheme as neither socialism nor imperialism, but as an imaginative effort to develop a neglected region in the interest of its own people and the rest of the world. Although touted as novel, the idea of developing African colonies to supply Britain with raw materials for mutual benefit was first advanced by Frederick Lugard in his 1922 work, The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa. Lugard admitted that British activities have never and will never originate from motives of pure philanthropy. The aim of civilized administration, however, was to fulfill a dual mandate, or rather, maintain a twofold responsibility, one towards serving Britain's resource needs and another towards developing Africa so that their native races can progress to a higher plane. Reflecting this sentiment, the Aberdeen Journal rallied public support for the Groundnut Scheme with the headline, "A scheme that could help these and us," yet reminds readers that since the labourer will be an African savage, wearing little clothing and no shoes, the task will be long and unpleasant. Such depictions reinforce Lugard's paternalistic vision that framed African development as both Britain's moral duty and a burden to be endured in pursuit of its own recovery. Accordingly, the Groundnut Scheme renewed the elementary logic of the dual mandate, that of using African land and labour to sustain Britain's economic recovery and its global influence. Whether to deflect charges of imperialism or out of genuine goodwill, the scheme did in fact incorporate policies for Tanganyikans' welfare, both as core aims and as ancillary benefits. It was imagined as a spectacle for Africans to behold, or according to Samuel, a practical demonstration of the wealth which large-scale scientific agriculture can provide. Agricultural experts at the time were obsessed with the supposed inefficiency of African peasant production and its inability to provide for growing populations. The labor-intensive use of axes, hand hoes, and fire was simply no match for the capital-intensive farm employing bulldozers, tractors, graders, mechanical planters, and artificial fertilizers. Modern farming, wrote industrial economist Edith Penrose, is the only way in many areas to produce enough to maintain or improve the living conditions of increasing populations. Time-honored methods such as shifting cultivation, intercropping, and the integration of pastoralism with agriculture, products of adaptation and deep familiarity with the local environment, were now considered incompatible with present needs. Additionally, since tsetse fly inhabited the bush, clearing it would supposedly eradicate the pests and open up the interior to settlement and livestock. Here, planners envisioned not just fields of peanuts, but the creation of modern, healthy, and self-sufficient African communities. Model villages were to be equipped with schools, clinics, canteens, and recreational spaces, intending to provide living standards far in advance of anything that was available to the existing labour in the territory. At Kongwa, 5 schools were established by 1949, while workers at Urambo held dances, sports competitions, and opened their own schools. Villages were planned to house over 1,000 people, including 300 African workers and their families, with 5 European supervisors overseeing each. Enticed by the villages' services, the villages were intended to replace the transient migrant labour system with settled communities. Planners hence portrayed the scheme not as a purely extractive enterprise, but as a generative one intended to foster both social progress alongside economic output. Once training was provided and the acute fat shortage solved, it was also envisioned that the scheme's management would eventually be transferred to the Tanganyikan administration and carried out by Black Africans. Despite its rosy ambitions, the groundnut scheme was abandoned in 1951 without ever exporting a single groundnut. In fact, it imported more groundnuts as seeds than it was able to harvest. It cost £36 million of taxpayers' money, more than 5 times Tanganyika's annual budget, the equivalent of nearly £1 billion today. Dr. Matteo Rizzo, senior lecturer in development at the School of Oriental and African Studies, claims that it is hard to find another instance of a colonial development project that underachieved its targets as spectacularly as the Groundnut Scheme did. For me, I came to this topic through an interest in development studies, a field in which many projects, both large and small, unceremoniously fail. Between 1983 to 2011, almost 30% of all World Bank development projects underachieved their stated objectives. I'm intrigued by how good intentions can go awry and by the ways in which past failures can inform practitioners on how development might be done better. Detailing every reason for the Groundnut Scheme's failure would be an endless task, but the main ones are worth mentioning. One newspaper reported the gross blundering has been at top levels, where no reasonable measures were taken to lay the proper groundwork of preparation. The first fundamental flaw was a lack of initial consultation with the locals. Although the feasibility mission consulted with local administrators, businessmen, and white farmers, tribespeople on whose land the scheme was based were not, such as the Mwera in the south, Wagogo and Maasai in the center, or Nyamwezi in the west. If consulted, they would have learned that Kongwa meant land of perpetual drought in the Wagogo language. In any project initiated from outside the community, disregarding local voices not only alienates participants, but can lead to profound misunderstandings of the ecological landscape. In addition, driven by the rush to deliver results before the next election, the project bypassed a pilot phase, dismissed skeptical experts, and yielded to ministerial pressure, deepening its ecological and logistical misjudgments. Based on data stretching back only 7 years, rainfall was severely overestimated. Whereas the Wakefield report predicted that drought would occur once every 5 years, it actually occurred 3 out of 6 years. Moreover, the clay soil baked during the dry season and broke harvesting equipment. The thorn bush, at times 15 feet high, was also more intractable than imagined. Special de-rooting machines were improvised to dig out deep, tangled masses of roots, and when this failed, converted tanks called shervicks were tied together with chains and plowed through the scrub. The poor condition of second-hand machinery meant that a large portion remained out of action. In Kongwa's first year, 25% of the 420 tractors were unusable. By 1949, in Nanching Weir, the figure had risen to 80%. More miserably, the lack of rolling stock on the nation's railways meant that not enough fuel could be delivered at regular intervals to operate the machines. Therefore, clearing was more difficult than imagined, reaching only 7% of the target. Rosette disease, known to the region, also plagued the Yarambo site. In addition, the port of Dar es Salaam, lacking a deep water berth, necessitated all cargo to be unpacked and put onto smaller vessels in order to dock. This, in addition to abysmal record-keeping, left the port congested and contributed to frustrating delays. Though costs ballooned and problems mounted early on, the scheme persisted for 4 futile years. Part of the reason was reputational. Several prominent peoples made embarrassing claims on its inevitable success. Scratchy, for example, told officials in Dar es Salaam that he would be proud to have been associated with the scheme in years to come, a claim which was publicized widely. Beyond personal ego, in late 1949, Scratchy circulated a cabinet paper warning that shutting the scheme down would not only acknowledge the loss of £30 million, but also deal a disastrous blow to the prestige of public enterprise. Unwilling to concede defeat, officials kept the scheme alive long past its viability. To deflect blame, some even accused the chief scientific officer, Hugh Bunting, of being an undercover communist intent on sabotaging the scheme, prompting the Secret Service to open a case on him and watch his movements for years afterwards. This 1951 cartoon, by portraying the symbolic peanut as an abandoned child, highlights how by the scheme's end, no one, even the people who gave birth to the scheme, wanted to claim responsibility for it. However, with the publication of Alan Wood's expose memoir, The Groundnut Affair, in early 1950, followed by a 6-hour Parliament debate fueled by a lethal Public Accounts Committee report, the Groundnut Scheme was finally put to rest. The failure was politically damaging for Labour and no doubt played a role in its defeat at the 1951 election. In the end, Britain relied on costly imports to solve its fats crisis. On the 8th of May 1954, it lifted rationing on butter, margarine and cooking fat, drawing on dairy from Australia, New Zealand and Denmark, and vegetable oils from Malaya, Nigeria and Ceylon. For the Tanganyikans, the scheme seems to have come and gone without much fuss, though its impact is hard to gauge both to its limited lifespan and the lack of African voices throughout. In the short term, while the Groundnut Scheme injected over £10 million into Tanganyika's economy, improved railways, employed up to 27,000 Africans and raised wages, especially in the sisal industry, It also drove inflation, labour shortages in rival industries, and social unrest around Kongwa. The millions did little to achieve the intended development objectives concerning the creation of idyllic, healthy communities and agricultural flourishing in the dryland. But it did, according to the Tanganyikan Standard, put Tanganyika on the map and keep it there. To conclude, the Groundnut Scheme showcases post-war Britain's pivot towards grand, centrally planned development approaches that sought to reconcile anti-imperial rhetoric with continued extraction. The story reveals the fragility of ambition when basic components of project management are neglected. Throughout the decades, the Groundnut Scheme has become associated with state-sponsored folly and was continuously referenced in popular culture. The World News section of a 1951 Dan Dare comic pokes fun at the scheme by fictitiously announcing that peanuts in the year 1995 have just begun to arrive in London. It also remains prominent in the minds of development experts today as a cautionary tale, being a textbook case of mega-project hubris, marked by overpromises, inadequate testing, and sustained only by political pressure. Overall, the Groundnut Scheme occupies a landmark place in the history of development, revealing how the new imperialism of development sought to distinguish itself from older forms of colonial extraction. Unlike earlier ventures, it was wary of overt displacement and exploitation, and instead presented itself as an altruistic, technocratic mission to modernize and uplift. Yet beneath this rhetoric of progress lay a familiar civilizing mission narrative, this time grounded in the ultimate faith of agricultural science, central planning, and their transformative power of machinery. But such forces, however grand, prove powerless against the quiet authority of patience, local knowledge, and ecological realities. Thanks for watching! I hope you enjoyed my story about peanuts.